Before you start reading, if you believe in justice and second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss stories like this. Now let's begin. James Mitchell stood in his kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, as he stared at the official letter from Sunrise Valley Homeowners Association. His hands trembled slightly. For 43 years, his family had owned this land. His father had bought it in 1980, a small but beautiful 3-acre property on the edge of town. James had grown up here. He'd gotten married here. His children had played in the yard. He'd buried his mother in the garden she'd planted decades ago. But according to the HOA letter dated that morning, none of that mattered. The property is in violation of community standards, the letter read. As of 60 days from this notice, your land will be seized and redeveloped for the community good. Non-negotiable. James read it again. Then a third time. What they were suggesting was impossible. What they were about to do would be the biggest mistake of their lives. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to teach them a lesson about greed and injustice that would echo through Sunrise Valley for generations to come. Who is James Mitchell? James Mitchell was 62 years old, a man who'd worked his entire life as an electrical engineer. He wasn't wealthy by Silicon Valley standards, but he'd built a comfortable life through decades of honest work and careful savings. His wife, Patricia, was a retired school teacher. Together, they'd created a modest paradise on their 3 acres, a small farmhouse, a barn, a large garden, and a workshop where James built furniture as a hobby. The property wasn't ostentatious. It didn't have the marble columns or infinity pools that defined modern suburban wealth. It was simply theirs, a place of memories, hard work, and genuine happiness. But that's exactly why it bothered people. The rise of Sunrise Valley. Sunrise Valley had changed dramatically over the past 15 years. What was once a quiet community of working-class families had transformed into an upscale residential development. Tech companies moved to the area. Property values skyrocketed. Young millionaires started buying homes and tearing them down to build massive modern structures that looked like hotels. The Homeowners Association, once a simple organization that organized neighborhood barbecues and maintained community roads, became something else entirely. New leadership took over. Specifically, Victoria Chen, a real estate developer's wife with political ambitions and a vision for transforming Sunrise Valley into an ultra-luxury enclave. The problem? James's property, with its modest farmhouse and rustic charm, was exactly the kind of blight they wanted to eliminate. Where the conflict began, it started with a letter in March. The HOA claimed James's property violated 17 different community standards. The farmhouse exterior didn't match approved architectural guidelines. The barn was aesthetically inappropriate for the neighborhood. The property wasn't properly landscaped, meaning it looked natural instead of manicured. The mailbox was the wrong color. The fence had weathered to gray instead of maintaining its original stain. The letter demanded compliance within 90 days. James called the HOA office. Victoria Chen answered personally, which should have been his first warning. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your property is clearly in violation. The neighborhood aesthetic is being compromised by your farm. Sunrise Valley is supposed to be upscale now. Your place looks like it belongs somewhere else." "This is my home," James said quietly. "My family has lived here for decades." "Yes, well, times change," Victoria replied. "We're offering you a generous severance if you sell to the HOA now. $450,000 for 3 acres that could be worth $3 million in 5 years once it's redeveloped. We're being quite reasonable. The land was worth over $2 million at current market rates." The offer was an insult. James refused. He followed all HOA guidelines to the letter. He repainted his fence. He updated his mailbox. He landscaped according to their specifications. The HOA rejected each improvement and added new complaints. His property was too old. His garden was too wild. His barn was too rustic. There was no end to their demands. Then came the letter that changed everything. the final eviction notice on a cold November morning, James received notification that the HOA had invoked community enhancement provisions in the original deed. These were clauses written into property documents decades ago, meant for extreme situations: complete property abandonment, serious environmental hazards, criminal activity. The HOA claimed his modest farmhouse represented community blight that qualified as grounds for seizure. They weren't offering money. They were taking the land. Patricia wept when she read the document. This wasn't just a home. This was where they'd buried their dreams alongside the garden her mother-in-law had planted 40 years ago. The workshop where James had built toys for his grandchildren. The porch where they'd watched countless sunsets. James hired a lawyer. Thomas Richardson was a good man, a lawyer who still believed in justice. He reviewed the case carefully. "This is wrong," Thomas said, shaking his head. "The deed language is archaic. Modern courts don't interpret it this way. We can fight this, James, but it's going to be expensive." Very expensive, it was. Over the next 6 months, James spent $80,000 in legal fees. They filed injunctions. They demanded mediations. They presented evidence showing James was in perfect compliance with all reasonable HOA standards. Victoria Chen attended every hearing with a team of corporate lawyers. The HOA presented a rendering, a beautiful modern mixed-use development where James's farmhouse used to stand. Luxury condos, an upscale shopping area, a resort-style community pool. The property would generate $300 million in economic activity, Victoria presented to the judge. The community benefit far outweighs Mr. Mitchell's personal attachment to his outdated structure. The judge was sympathetic to James. But the law, as written, gave the HOA grounds to proceed. "I'm ordering mediation," the judge said. "Both parties have 45 days to reach agreement. If not, the seizure proceeds." The neighbors' turn. What hurt James most wasn't the legal battle. It was watching his neighbors turn against him. Some had already sold to the developers. They had new houses, new cars, new wealth. They'd been transformed by the money flooding into Sunrise Valley. They saw James's resistance as an obstacle to their prosperity. Others were simply intimidated by Victoria Chen and the HOA's growing power. Speaking up meant facing fines, harassment, or their own properties suddenly becoming non-compliant. At the community meeting where the HOA presented the development plan, 200 people attended. James saw familiar faces, people he'd known for 20 years. They looked away, only a handful spoke in his defense. Margaret Liu, who'd lived next door for 18 years, stood up and said James's farm had actually increased property values and community character. The HOA responded by finding 17 code violations on her property. Within 2 weeks, she sold and moved away. One elderly man named Robert, who'd lived in the community since the 1970s, shook James's hand privately. "I remember when they wanted to do the same thing to me," Robert whispered. "I didn't have the strength to fight them like you are. I'm sorry I don't have courage left to help you now." The personal toll Patricia developed anxiety. She couldn't sleep. She'd walk through the garden at night, touching the roses her mother-in-law had planted, knowing it might all be gone soon. James threw himself into work, but his focus shattered. He missed important details on a project. His boss, sympathetic at first, grew impatient. "James, we need you to be present," his boss said. "I understand your situation, but we can't have your personal problems affecting your work." James was put on probation. Their son called from across the country. "Dad, just take the money. It's not worth your health. It's not worth your marriage," but James couldn't accept it. This wasn't about money. This was about principle. This was about whether working people, honest people, could be crushed by corporate interests and slick lawyers simply because their property didn't fit someone else's vision of progress. The turning point, then, on a Wednesday afternoon, James received an unexpected call from a man named David Park. David was a real estate attorney, and he was investigating the HOA. "Mr. Mitchell, I represent a class of homeowners in 3 different communities where this same development company has operated. David explained. They use the same tactics. Find older properties, declare them in violation, seize them through HOA provisions, then develop them for massive profit while the original owners get nothing. "Why are you calling me?" James asked. "Because you're about to get something no one else has gotten, a chance to see what they're actually planning to do with your land." David explained that he'd obtained documents in another case showing the development company's real financial projections. They weren't generating $300 million in community benefit. They were generating $300 million in profit going directly into the pockets of Victoria Chen and her partners. "They're stealing land," David said simply. "It's legal theft, but it's still theft." "What can I do?" James asked, his heart racing. "That depends," David said slowly. "How much would it hurt them if they completed this project?" James didn't understand the question. "Would you be willing to let them finish?" David asked. "Would you be willing to let them build their development? Just let them spend $100 million building something on your land, then take it all back?" Out you the strategy emerges, David Park wasn't just asking a random question. He'd found something in the legal documents. A loophole. A technical error made by the same lawyers who'd drafted the HOA provisions decades ago. The seizure was technically illegal. Oh, it looked legal. The paperwork looked perfect. The judge had approved it. But there was one problem. The process violated a state statute on property rights. It was a small violation. Technical. But it was there. The problem was that to fight it properly in court would take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars. By then, the development would be built. By then, it wouldn't matter. Unless... What if, David explained to James, they completed the entire development on property they didn't legally own? What if we let them spend $100 million of their own money building structures on land that, through an unenforced legal technicality, you still legally own? James stared at him. Then, David continued, after they've invested everything, after they've leased out the condos, after they've opened the shops, after everything is complete and operational and generating profit, then we file the motion. We point out the technical violation. And suddenly, they've built a $100 million development on your land, with no legal right to be there. What happens then? James asked. Then they either pay you everything, which would be $100 million plus the value of the property, or they have to demolish it all and leave. They can't legally operate anything on your land. They can't sell it. They can't lease it. They can't even keep it standing. It was brilliant and terrible at the same time. There's risk, David warned. If the judge disagrees with our interpretation of the law, you could lose everything anyway. And they'll have time to get creative, to find loopholes themselves. But if we're right, if the law actually protects you the way I think it does, then they've dug themselves into a hole so deep they can't climb out. How deep is the hole? James asked. Deep enough to bury them. The agreement James had 1 week to decide. He spent that week in his garden, sitting on the bench his father had built in 1985. He thought about his mother, buried in that soil. He thought about Patricia and what was fair to ask her to endure. He thought about the neighbors who'd abandoned him. He thought about justice. On Friday, he called David Park. "Let's do it," James said. The strategy was simple. James would not fight the seizure. He would accept the HOA's terms gracefully. He would sign the papers. He would transfer the deed. He would take the $450,000 severance and move to a small apartment across town. To the HOA, it would look like victory. To the development company, it would look like another successful land grab. They would never suspect what was coming. They would begin construction immediately. The waiting 3 years passed. James and Patricia moved into a modest apartment. It was difficult. There were nights when Patricia cried silently. Nights when James questioned whether he was making a terrible mistake, whether he should have just lived out his final years peacefully in his home. But he held the faith. The development rose on his old land. Month by month, the farmhouse was demolished. The barn disappeared. The garden where his mother lay became parking spaces. The luxury condos went up, glass and steel monuments to greed. The upscale retail shops opened. The resort-style pool was installed. It was beautiful, in a sterile, corporate way. It was everything Victoria Chen had promised, and every dollar spent was a dollar spent on land the development company didn't legally own. David Park monitored everything. He filed the papers. He documented violations. He prepared the legal case with meticulous care. On a Tuesday morning in March, after 2 years and 4 months of construction and 1 year of full operation, David Park filed a motion with the court. The motion was only 12 pages long, but those 12 pages contained everything the judge needed to know. The HOA seizure had violated State Statute 4782B regarding property rights transfers. The violation had never been corrected. The development company had built a $100 million project on property they didn't legally own. James Mitchell still owned the land. The collapse. The response from the development company was immediate and panicked. Their lawyers argued that the statute had been implicitly waived. It had been overlooked by everyone. Why should it suddenly matter now? The judge's response was simple. Because the law is the law, regardless of how inconvenient that might be for your client. The court issued an immediate injunction. The development company could not accept any more leases. They could not make any more sales. They could not operate any businesses on the property. All existing commercial operations had 60 days to cease operations and vacate. Within 48 hours, media outlets across the state were reporting the story. Land seizure goes wrong. Developer loses $100 million project to technical legal error. But it wasn't a technical error to James. It was justice. Within a week, the development company offered him a settlement. $95 million for the land and the completed structures. James declined. $95 million isn't the cost, he told David Park. The cost is everything they built. The condos stay. The shops stay. They pay me operational control and full profit share, or nothing. Or they demolish it, and I keep the land empty and undeveloped forever. It took 3 days of negotiations before Victoria Chen realized she'd lost. The development company accepted James's terms. He would receive $30 million in cash for the land rights. He would receive 60% of all future profits from the shopping district. He would receive 40% of rental income from the residential units. They calculated it would total somewhere between $150 million and $200 million over the next 15 years. James had turned a $450,000 theft into a $150 million victory. The reckoning 3 weeks after the settlement, James Mitchell walked onto his property for the first time in 2 years. The farmhouse was gone. The barn was gone. The garden was gone. Where his mother lay buried, there were now professional landscaping and perfectly maintained flower beds. It should have broken him. It didn't. Instead, James walked into the upscale shopping district and looked at the names on the stores. Luxury boutiques, expensive restaurants, high-end galleries. And on the directory board, in small letters, it read, Development Property, James Mitchell, property owner. Patricia was crying, but not from sadness. You did it, she said, squeezing his hand. You actually did it. Victoria Chen had resigned from the HOA the week after the settlement became public. The other board members, panicked by the prospect of similar discoveries in their own tenure, voted to implement new oversight procedures and fired 3/4 of their legal staff. The development company's stock price dropped 20% in a single day when investors realized the company's entire business model had been fundamentally flawed and possibly criminal. What James did with it. All but the real story wasn't about revenge. It was about what James did next. With his new wealth, James didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a yacht or a sports car. Instead, he created the Mitchell Family Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting homeowners' rights against HOA overreach. He hired lawyers. He created a legal assistance program. He started fighting cases across the state where he saw the same patterns, where working people were being pushed out by corporate interests disguised as community improvement He won 12 cases in the first year. In each one, homeowners who'd been told they had no defense suddenly had a team of lawyers working for free. David Park became the fund's director. Together they changed the law. 3 years after James's case, the state legislature passed the Mitchell Act, which revised HOA seizure provisions and added criminal penalties for abuse. Lessons for the World. James's story teaches us several important truths. First, sometimes justice requires patience. James didn't win the moment he filed his lawsuit. He won by playing the long game, by being willing to sacrifice in the short term for a larger victory. Second, the law protects the prepared. Victoria Chen thought she had won because she had lawyers and money. What she didn't realize was that James had something more powerful, someone who understood the law deeply enough to see the crack in her foundation. Third, ordinary people can defeat powerful systems. James Mitchell was just an electrical engineer with a modest farmhouse. He wasn't connected. He wasn't wealthy. He was just willing to stand and fight, and he won. The unexpected aftermath. 4 years after receiving his settlement, James received an email from someone he didn't expect. It was Robert, the elderly neighbor who'd apologized for not having the courage to help fight the HOA. Robert was now living in a different community, but he'd heard about the Mitchell Act. He'd heard that James had won, that James was using his victory to help others. "I was wrong to give up," Robert wrote. "I wish I'd had your courage. But I'm grateful someone did." James invited Robert to dinner. They sat together and talked about how power works, about how systems can be rigged against ordinary people, and about how sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say no, loudly enough that others finally realize they can say it too. A message to today's world. If there's a lesson for today, it's this. We live in a world where powerful interests are constantly testing the boundaries of what they can get away with. They're counting on us to accept their authority, to believe that resistance is futile, to surrender because fighting back seems impossible. James Mitchell's story says otherwise. It says that if you know the law, if you're willing to be patient, if you understand that sometimes letting your enemy complete their plan is the best way to destroy them, then ordinary people can still win. It says that justice, delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it's just justice being prepared, and it says that real power belongs to those who understand the rules, well enough to turn the system back on itself. The final word. James Mitchell is now 71 years old. He still lives in his modest apartment with Patricia. They don't live lavishly despite his wealth. Instead, they use their money to help others, to fight the Victoria Chens of the world, to protect the properties and homes of working people who believe, as James does, that a place is worth more than money if it's truly yours. The luxury development still stands on the land where his farmhouse once was. It's profitable now. Money flows from it to James's foundation, where it funds legal battles across the state. And in every case, James teaches people the same lesson he learned. Sometimes the best way to win is to let your enemy finish their project first. Sometimes the sweetest victory comes not from fighting them when they're building, but from taking it all back when they're done. If this story inspires you to stand up for what's right, to believe that ordinary people can defeat powerful systems, then please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have countless more stories of justice, redemption, and ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. Hit that subscribe button now, and I'll see you in the next incredible story of courage and victory.